again, for awesome, thanks, Samin. For everyone we're meeting for the first time today, thank you for joining us. Welcome. And for those who we've reeled back in, it's good to see you again and thank you for coming. At Jalapeno, our vision is to build a world where individuals and companies can reach their full potential. To help our clients in this vision, we are committed to providing them with the services and tools that they may need to reach this potential and work towards creating and fulfilling a meaningful life at the workplace. We do this by leveraging technology and psychology to help our clients develop essential skills while creating sustainable and humanized work environments. To fulfill our mission, we have a team of experts, including consultants, coaches, counselors, and trainers that leverage our proprietary software to unlock the team's potential. All right, so again, we appreciate you taking off time to be with us here today. So let's talk a little bit about what we have planned for you. The first few minutes, I will be talking about the Jalapeno events norms. And then one of our panelists, Samin Sadat, will do an exercise with you. And then after that, Jim Brosso will be speaking about how to build inclusion in our socially distanced world. Then we have the panel discussion to go in depth into how to foster inclusivity in the workplace. And finally, before we conclude the session, we have a little surprise planned for you and the community today. So stay tuned and stay engaged. All right, so before we share our secret sauce for inclusive teams today, we would like to share a few of our event norms with you first. This is a safe space, so you don't have to show your face or say your name or mention your company name if you prefer not to. If you would like to join the conversation, please add your thoughts and feedback to the chat, or you can message me privately and I'll do your best, or we will do our best to answer your questions. Secondly, everyone is here for a reason, so please listen to understand and not to judge. Our intention during these discussions is not to come to a consensus, but to share different perspectives. And then third, we appreciate no interruptions. So no one loves being cut off. Please do not interrupt our speakers. And if you have any question, feel free to use the Zoom icon to raise your hand if you want to speak. The icon is illustrated on the screen right now. And finally, mute your audio. Make sure your audio is muted until you're ready to speak. Doing this cuts down on background noise that could pull focus away from our speaker. Now, onto our learning outcomes. We believe in building, educating, and providing useful resources to the community. Some of the learning outcomes that you'll be able to take away by the end of the event today include how to make diversity and inclusion part of our daily interactions in the online world, how to evaluate and optimize inclusion within our team, and how to provide growth opportunities by becoming a conscious and virtual individual and organization. We hope that you find our spicy hotline event engaging and insightful. All right, so I think you've heard enough of me. To kick off the event, I will pass the torch over to our Executive Director, Samin Sadat, to facilitate the coming exercise. Before I do that, I'll let you know a little bit about her. Samin has always been intrigued by the human brain behavior and interactions with their environment. After spending long hours at the psychology lab at UBC and completing her master's at the Sanders School of Business, she entered the workforce and observed a gap between what research suggests and what companies actually do to increase their productivity and profitability. Now, Samin is on a mission to bridge this gap through Jalapeno employee engagement, leveraging technology and professional human services to bring research findings to life and help companies save invaluable dollars and help individuals enhance their quality of life. Without further ado, welcome Samin, and feel free to use the applause reaction on Zoom.
Cool. Thank you, Imaima. I'm just gonna share my screen before I start, so awesome. Okay. All right, thumbs up if you see the question why businesses are the most powerful agent for change. All right, perfect. All right, welcome everyone. And as Imaima said, thank you so much for spending your Wednesday evening with us to really learn about what inclusion is and what we can do to make sure we are being more inclusive in our interactions. So the first question I want to start with, why we are keep targeting business owners and workforce? Why not parents? Why not school? Why most sort of the messaging we hear is for workforce? So for parenting, we really cannot tell people how they to raise their kids. Trust me, my initial project before Jalapeno was to license parenting, and that was not successful. When it comes to school and universities, usually the group of people that we're going to be talking about, they may not necessarily even sign up on enroll universities. But when it comes to workforce, there is a big incentive for everyone to join workforce, and that's money. At some point, people are going to join the workforce to pay their bills. And the second thing is we do spend majority of our days and majority of our lives in workforce. So what happens is that you as the business owner, as the leader, you become in a position to have more power to make any changes when it comes to human sort of interactions and our culture. So the reason we are really investing in workforces because of the power we are having compared to parents and to universities. So let's just say this is your organization. This is the core of your organization. Whether you want it or not, the core of your organization is going to look like this: the people with different color, different life experience, different really abilities and disabilities. And I don't really think diversity is going to be a choice anymore. I think minority will be the majority of your organizations, whether you want it or not. What's this going to be a choice, whether you want to have that inclusive culture? So let's just say what happens really in organizations at the moment. So what happens at the core, we have all these diverse people, but for some reasons, people with certain individual differences are being pushed away from the core of the organization to the periphery of the organization. And really, people are being pushed away, not necessarily for lack of leadership skills or lack of communication skills. They're being pushed away for really characteristics that they don't have much control over it, and is not even impacting their performance. If we're pushing people away for lack of leadership, that's more acceptable. People can work on those skills and come back to the core of the organization. But really, what is happening, people are being pushed away because they're from different age, they have different accents, they have different life experience, they're single dad, single mom, they just really experience life differently. So what happens when they're being pushed away? Then we're starting noticing there's low morale in my team. There's low engagement. There is some toxic, destructive behavior that I'm observing in my team. And there's low contributions, and they're not just performing very well. And sometimes we might even jump into the conclusion and tell ourselves that, you know what, they are being pushed away in the periphery of the organization because of these behaviors. But majority of times, these behaviors, these destructive behaviors to themselves and the organization is the outcome of being pushed away. So maybe the next question we should be asking ourselves, why do we see such destructive behaviors when there is such exclusion? So to address that question for you, a psychologist did a very interesting.
You're on mute, Samin. Unmute, Samin.
Samin, you're muted.
I was muted the whole time?
No,
okay.
I just started with this slide.
Oh, okay. All right, so everyone can see sort of the two people like this drawing. Awesome. All right, so a psychologist did a very interesting experiment. So brought participants in the lab in an MRI machine, where you can scan the brain. And as you being the participant, ask you to play this game. So the game was pretty simple. When you were receiving the ball, you get to choose who you want to pass the ball to, and you were just passing the ball. So it was a really fun, simple game. But what happened in the middle of the game, the other two players stopped passing the ball to you. And that's when things get interesting. So let me go back to my slide to tell you what happened. So when you as the participant, you are not receiving the ball anymore, they realize the part of your brain, the region of your brain that gets activated when you're in physical pain, got activated when you were feeling excluded. So that sort of gave us some insights that social exclusion pain is a real pain. It's like similar to other physical pain. And to make it more even convincing, when you give painkillers such as Advil to such participants, then the activity of your brain in the pain region gets reduced, but also your experience of pain gets reduced. So maybe next time we are sort of seeing there are such destructive behaviors are happening from some people, really see maybe these behaviors are for the pain management. I just sort of got, okay. So it's really for them to manage their pains. It's just because they've been in pain constantly and it's turning into a chronic pain for them. I'm going to leave you with doing one activity, and then we're going to pass it to Jim to really talk about the practical sort of tips on how we can reduce such pains and proactively even avoid such pains. So if you have a piece of pen and paper or your iPad or your laptop, I want you to write down the name of top 3 to 5 people who you trust the most. All right. Now I want you to look at your list and see how many of them have different age, race, gender, sex, religion, or even professional background from you. So we have done this experiment with many participants, and something we observe constantly, that we trust the people that are more similar to us. And this is honestly, it's nothing to be ashamed of. This is really a natural human tendency. Our brain has evolved to really find comfort in familiarity. So that's why we really trust people that are similar to us. But usually we hire people that we trust. We promote people that we trust. So it means we really make those decisions based on, oh, who's very similar to me. So I know this is a natural human tendency. It was serving its purpose when we were at Homo sapien time, but right now it can have some detrimental impact for ourselves and our company. Because what it does, it creates this bubble, this echo chamber around yourself that constantly confirming and enhancing your false assumptions, is not showing your blind spot, and there's nothing there to challenge you to really see what you cannot see. And just that can be very damaging in terms of financial costs and emotional costs for yourself, for your business, and your people. And now I'm gonna pass it to Imaima to move on to the next section. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you, Samin, for the warm-up. I hope we're now ready and open to listen to our expert. Oh, I'll just share my screen real quick. All right, so I hope we are ready to listen to our expert, Jim Broso. I'll let you know a little bit about Jim. He has been working with teams for almost 3 decades and is passionate about educating people about the roles that relationships and interpersonal friction have in the success or failure of a project. Today, he leads a team of 12 facilitators delivering project management and leadership workshops that embody this philosophy of focusing primarily on team relationships to over 2,000 people each year. Jim has volunteered with Crisis Intervention and Suicide Prevention Center of BC, and he has worked in support of homeless communities in Burnaby. He has published 2 books, numerous technical articles, and presented at major conferences and many local professional associations. Throughout his presentation, you can add questions that come to your mind to the chat box, and we'll be monitoring it, and we'll have a panel discussion to address these questions at the end of the presentation. That being said, please join me in welcoming Jim Broso.
All right, thanks so much for that. And I hope I see that I'm not on mute, which is a good thing. So first of all, I want to thank Samin, everybody at Jalapeno for inviting me back after being together, I think last fall, for another conversation online. In that initial call, we talked about the difference between diversity and inclusion, which I think it was important to make a distinction between the two. And today I want to go a little bit further into this thinking. In Samin's opening, she talked about the actual physiological challenges that people have when they are not included, when they are isolated. And that's a very important thing. There's a lot of biology that brought us to where we are today that still can act as a barrier for us to become fully inclusive with one another. But I want to talk today about what being inclusive really means in an organization. And I want to talk about if we're thinking about building up our diversity or becoming more inclusive, I think there's an appropriate order to do those things, which would be valuable. And over the last year, it's very interesting. As we first talked about doing this webinar, we were talking about dealing with the issues around what's happened to all of us in the last year. We've got a global pandemic. We are now almost all working from home. We're spending more time on Zoom than we would like to. And originally, I thought of all of those things as potential barriers for moving forward towards inclusion. What I've come to learn as I've rolled all this around my head, and I've done a lot of reading and thinking about this, is that really we are at the right time to really make a difference when we're dealing with inclusion in organizations. And it has nothing to do with rote learning. It has nothing to do with checking a box in organizations. It has to do with opening our minds to new possibilities. As Samin talked about a few minutes ago, it's about becoming conscious in the workplace and appreciating that we should not be afraid of inclusion. It becomes a very powerful asset for us as individuals and as the organization, if we want to really get better at what we do and for our business to be more successful as well. So just a quick recap from last time around. Diversity is merely that measure of how different we are. And you take any 2 people in this room and there's going to be at least a dozen forms of diversity between any of those 2 people. It may be something that really stands out, like gender or culture. It may be age. It may be one person is left-handed, the other is right-handed. There's all kinds of different forms of diversity. That exists, and it always has, and it always will. The issue is that the world's getting more crowded. We're becoming more diverse in our team makeup. I was told a couple of years ago that Burnaby is actually the most racially diverse city in the world. And it doesn't surprise me, given what I see here. But for more and more reasons, there are times when people that have diversity, whether it's visible forms or not, are going to interact with each other. And as Samin alluded to, we have these biological tendencies. Think of tribalism, for example, of trying to stay in clusters of likeness, if you will. We can no longer do that, okay? Until recently, it's been pretty easy to not bother to work towards more effective inclusion. I've run inclusion and diversity training, although I've never really called it that, in workshops for 20 years. And I was telling some of the people before we started the call today, I was in a workshop where somebody was reflecting on that workshop, and the work we did on day one about diversity inclusion, he characterized it as, oh, that theoretical stuff. And I said, well, wait a minute, does that mean, when you say theoretical stuff, does that mean that you've just never experienced that in the real world? And he paused and he thought, yeah. I mean, it's something we can easily push off to one side, or we've been able to anyways. If we learn to effectively take all these forms of diversity and embrace them, and to appreciate that any way that you're different than I am is a potential opportunity to broaden our collective perspectives on how we address issues, how we tackle problems. It's very, very important to do that. So we'll talk about that a little bit more, and we'll talk about the fact that it's been easy to not bother so far to get more inclusive. Like I said, historically, there's all kinds of drivers against inclusion, and it's not just biological. There's also corporate culture biases as well. There's, especially in North America, there's very strong tendency in the corporate world to think of leadership as being a hierarchical power wielding that you have over people in the organization, which is a situation where you pay attention to your boss. And in cultures around the world, there are some cultures that have, for example, filial piety that you might experience if you interact with people from some Asian cultures, for example. So there's a lot of things that drive against deep inclusion, both biological and institutional, that we're fighting against here. And many of us, I'd say most of us, all of us, have plenty to learn about this. There's people like me, and if I look at everybody who's got their cameras on, I'm kind of standing out as one of the few white men in the room, and I'm just going to put that out there. And so for us in the category of white men, and I have to say right now that any category that we produce is one of those simplifying structures that we use to make sense of our complex world. But in that category of old white men, many of us, especially if we've lived in North America, if we've worked in North American companies, we have had the luxury of not being exposed to that exclusion that many other people on the call have had. So when I talk about there being plenty to learn, there is plenty that I am still learning these days. When we talk about what's happened in Canada over the last 75 years or so, I only learned about 10 or 15 years ago about this whole thing about residential schools. This is not something that was part of our history class in school. My wife, who was born in Hong Kong, she's of Chinese origin, she lived up in northern Vancouver Island for a couple of years. She actually lived in the same town as a residential school, and she wasn't aware of it until I told her about it 2 months ago. So we have a lot to learn about what we've done, individuals, religions, governments, organizations that have diminished other people, and we need to learn more effective ways to reconcile and to make sense of these things. There have been few organizations that have decided that it's time to take action to make change for that, and I think the time is now for us to actually take that action. Okay. So you could argue that over the last year, there's more and more barriers than ever. Like I said, we're all working from home. We're dealing with this COVID, this global pandemic. The pressures around that, where there's fearfulness about going out. There's the learning curve of trying to figure out how to interact with others online, as we do in Zoom, that sort of thing. There's a lot of arguments to say that there's more barriers than ever. Okay. There's also been a lot of events that have happened in the United States, in Canada, and other places in the world as well, that have really raised the intensity, if you will, of people that are pushing back against any perceived or real issue around not appreciating, not being inclusive with others. You think about Black Lives Matter, you think about all of these different things that have occurred. And in addition to that, social media is giving these people that have been diminished for so long, who have experienced this pain, this real pain, as Samin talked about, for so long, they now have a megaphone. There's a voice that everyone has, everyone can speak up. And there's more and more of this that's happening in the world. Okay, so those that have been marginalized have had enough. We're at a point where there is a loud screaming for change. When there was the trial in the States last week, I was rapt watching the verdict of the trial, and that became a very important, hopefully a watershed moment for a lot of people in potential change. We'll see what happens with all that, but there's a need for change. There's a palpable need that we can feel right now, and those in power really need to learn a number of things. And this whole notion of COVID, it's frayed our nerves, it's increased our tension, it's challenged our ability to connect. And we have all of these issues that are coming to a head right now. If I look for a metaphor for that, I think about maybe just a quick show of hands, raise your hand in the participant list or something like that, if you have an earthquake kit at home. Do you have an earthquake kit that you have prepared in advance and you're ready to go? How many people have that? We have 33 people on the call. I'm seeing a handful, less than 10. Everybody knows that we live in a place that's just waiting for the next big one. We at any moment, it could be in the middle of this call, we could get a magnitude 9 earthquake and really destroy things. So everybody in town, in Vancouver anyways, I know there's people from outside of town where there's fewer earthquakes, but everybody in town knows that this is a risk, that this is a concern. We haven't really done anything about it. If we were to have a magnitude 6, magnitude 7 earthquake tomorrow, I bet you that most of you would be building an earthquake kit on the weekend, and it would wake you up to action to be able to deal with that. So we're feeling the tremors right now of this whole inclusion issue that we have not yet addressed, but nobody's really taking concrete action. And I think that concrete action has to take place in several different forms. First is there's people who are, I guess, structural leaders in an organization. They're the people that run the business. They're the ones that that are responsible for driving the organization to change in certain ways. The first thing that every leader needs to do is to better understand where they are right now in regards to all of the issues around inclusion. What is the current culture in their organization? What are their hiring practices? What are their personnel review practices, whether they're annual? Are there any biases associated with any of those? Do they when they hire people, do they only hire people that are similar to them? Do they look for diversity? How do they deal with people that may have names that they can't pronounce on their resume? There's studies that show that is a significant barrier to people getting interviews. In this situation, I would argue that an external perspective can really bring discipline and less bias to the equation, because almost everyone has this personal bias. This is one of those simplifying things that we have, that we tend to believe we know more about something, or that we're more grounded, or we're more positive along the inclusion curve than we really are. So an external perspective brings some good discipline to the table there. They also need to be responsible to make sure that the organization has a culture to effectively manage any challenges that occur in the organization with respect to a lack of inclusion. Okay, and that is addressing those issues not by canceling the person, but with the intent to learn and to grow as an organization, to help people make the mistakes, to give them the space to make mistakes, but also to allow them to learn and change as a result of that. And also there needs to be some information that needs to go across the entire organization. And we can look at that in two different ways. There's already a number of organizations that I've seen that are going to just take stock training, dogmatic training, and say, this is what inclusion is all about in your organization. I think it's better to provide opportunities for people to discuss these issues with one another, to learn from each other's perspective, to be able to grow more organically. I think there's a lot of value in that. The other side of the coin, why the heck would leaders want to do this? I think is absolutely essential to push on. It is no longer simply a social requirement to say that we have to focus on inclusion. There was an article in this week's Business in Vancouver, and it was an article about a situation that occurred in Victoria, where it was an organization where somebody had been accused of abuse, of gender-based abuse in the organization, and that person was called out on social media right away. The organization that hired this person felt forced, driven, trapped between two different walls. On the one side, social media had already named these people without a trial, if you will, and they were looking for blood. And on the other side, the organization was really interested in making sure that they had a fair understanding of what exactly happened, that sort of thing. Turns out they felt that they had no alternative other than to fire this person, just to deal with that. So we're in a situation where this is really coming to a head. The important thing for leaders, though, is beyond that. This becoming more inclusive as an organization is probably the best risk reduction and best strategic initiative that many organizations can work for. You could look at the positives in terms of the cost savings, in terms of reduced turnover or recidivism or any of those issues around there. You look at the positivity that comes out of increased engagement, higher creativity and innovation, being able to draw from a broader source of a talent pool, if you will. There are so many arguments for building more effective inclusion in the organization that it's a question, why wouldn't an organization go forth to do that? So they need to start thinking about it. How do they stand up right now? How do they improve what they're doing from an inclusivity perspective? And what's in it for me? This is not an initiative that is a cost in an organization. This is an initiative that is a investment in the organization, and it will return a positive return on investment. I think it's important to recognize that there's an order to our work. I think there's danger, if you will, in just hiring more diverse people before we do anything about checking out whether we're inclusive or not. You know, and organizations will do that. They go, oh my God, we got to be more inclusive. So they will hire as much diversity as possible without really thinking about how is that going to land for the new employees? What are they coming into? What are we bringing them into in this organization? We get into situations where you get isolation, you get tokenism in these organizations. Welcome to our hostile environment is the way to go. No, we need to think about inclusion and make sure that we are prepared to bring people into the organization to be effective in the workplace. Then we can start building out and reaping the benefits of broad diversity and inclusion in our organizations. And like I said before, any group of people are going to have diversity. Okay, so we can learn a lot from the people that are in our organizations right now before we expand out. Okay, and for a CEO, for a leader in an organization, if any leader says, I understand everybody's perspective in this organization about how this organization lands on them, how it works on them, I would ask them, did they tell you because you've told them Did they tell you that you understand that because you've reflected back on them what they've told you? Because if they haven't, then that person does not know. And we'll get to that in a few minutes when we talk about empathy and why that's such an important element for true inclusion in an organization. Now, I talked about structural leaders a minute ago, but I think it's really important to say that we're all leaders. Whenever we engage with others, we are working to influence them in some way. All of our behaviors have an impact on everybody around us. So we need to understand and appreciate that every single one of us has our role to play in building out this organization. And the first step for all of us, including for leaders, is to reflect and understand how our experiences in the past have affected us. How have they shaped us into who we are today, how we interact with others, how we deal with diversity in the workplace or outside the workplace as well. We will have a place where we stand in terms of all the forms of diversity. And there are some forms of diversity that every one of us in the room will have been the oppressor, if you will, to others at one point or another. Okay. We all have gaps in our thinking about how we interact with others around us. Where can we become more inclusive? So we all need to have this basic stance to understand first. In an organizational environment, we all need to learn to be allies. And we need to learn to catch instances of failure to be truly inclusive in the organization and address it. There's no such thing as an innocent bystander in this world when it comes to inclusion in an organization. We need to learn that there's better value in calling in and addressing an issue that you see personally first, rather than just calling it out and putting it out on the on social media first off. We need to provide space in our organizations to stumble, because we are all learning in this, and big part of learning is making mistakes. We need to stumble and learn. We need to grow. And we need to be able to speak up. Every one of us needs to have the confidence, the comfort to have a voice in our organization. Talk about psychological safety as being one of the core elements of a really highly inclusive culture. The notion that anybody in the organization should have the confidence, should feel the safety to be able to speak up when they sense that something is not right for them, when there might have been a microaggression that was addressed in their form, any of those things. People need to have that psychological safety to speak up without any fear of being repressed, of being shot down, or being ignored in the organization. We need to take every one of these events and learn from these events as we go. And again, empathy is an absolutely essential attitude that we all have to bring to the table. If you haven't seen it before, go just look up RSA short and empathy, and Brené Brown spends about 3 minutes really giving you a succinct nutshell of what empathy is and what it isn't, sort of thing. And in that, she talks about Teresa Wiseman and the 4 attributes of empathy that Teresa Wiseman raises that are characteristics of empathy. So the first is being able to take the perspective of the other party. And in doing so, you need to stay out of judgment. And that is absolutely essential, and probably the most challenging part of this staying out of judgment, because it's so easy, especially we've spent our whole lives being non-inclusive for some sector of the population that is different than us. We need to be able to just simply understand why people hold the position that they hold. It is not our job to change them. It is not even our job to agree with them. It's our job to appreciate that their perspective is just as real and valid to them as your perspectives are to you. So whenever you diminish anybody else's perspective, how would it feel to you if you were crushed? How would this cat feel if they were dealt with by a mouse the same way they just dealt with the cat? Okay. And the other two elements are that you need to recognize the emotion that's in this situation. As Samin talked about earlier, this pain of rejection or being left out is real. It's an actual thing. So you need to recognize and appreciate that. And you need to be able to communicate that emotion. It's not about problem solving, it's about connecting, if you will. That is a skill that we all need to work on very, very much. And I think the best quote I've ever heard about empathy, and again, this goes back to CEOs that would dismissively say, I understand what everybody thinks about what's going on here, sort of thing. Daniel Dennett is a philosopher, and he said, you can only know that you truly empathize with somebody when the other person says, thanks. I wish I could have described my situation as eloquently as you just did. Which is to say, to empathize, you have to learn, you have to listen, you have to engage with the other party. You can't dismissively say, oh, I understand where they're coming from. That is not empathy, but we do this all too often in all of our relationships. So we have to learn about that. Study empathy. Go check out that quick Brene Brown video. That is an absolutely important part of what we're doing here. So we have this apparent crisis, and we need to turn this into an opportunity. We've been complacent, we've been tolerant, we've been ignorant, we've been resistant for too long. Things have to change. We're hitting this tipping point. There's some context where we've descended right into chaos. The use of language is shifting almost on a daily basis. We're all learning, we're all going to make mistakes. If we don't take this opportunity, there is danger of falling back to business as usual. This will blow over just like the last 15 times we've talked about this. We can't do that this time around. Virginia Satir was a family therapist, and one of her famous quotes was that familiarity is more powerful than comfort. And she said that in the context of battered wives who will have a tendency to stay in a broken relationship rather than face that dangerous world out there, sort of thing. And so we do have this tendency to stick with something that's not comfortable. Let's take advantage of the fact that this is more comfortable. We're at this tipping point, and Virginia Satir also had this model for change, if you will, where we're going to deal with stuff, we're going to tolerate with stuff with a little bit of friction for a while. But when we hit this tipping point, we descend into chaos. And I think that we're all there to some extent right now. We need to look for and find what that new world is going to look like when we get through this, when we become more inclusive, and recognize that everybody is a winner when we become inclusive together. Okay, the CEO of an organization does not lose power by building an organization that's more inclusive. Okay, that's very important. And a lot of the things that we thought of that initially when we talked about doing this webinar, that I talked about as being barriers, like working on Zoom, that sort of thing. People have been working remotely in diverse teams for years around the world. We're learning, we're getting better at this. I've learned that there's really nothing that we can't do in this online world that we could do in a face-to-face world as well. So we need to look for our shared path moving forward, and we have to be careful about not overshooting. And I think to some degree, we have overshot in some ways, okay? When people reach this breaking point, there's anger, there is a lot of friction that's generated. We've got the cancel culture, we've got all of these issues here. I think that to some degree, those behaviors are manifestations of the same dismissiveness that the old white men have when they're running organizations and they're not paying attention to what's happening around there. All of us that are involved in this process need to have the intent to work together, to learn, to grow, and to engage with one another, to build a world, not just a business or a family, a world where we're all able to see the value in every form of diversity that you and I have from one another. And if we can harness that, we can do such amazing things in organizations in the world around us. That's really all I have to say right now. I have a PDF that we'll be distributing afterwards that expands on these ideas a little bit. I would suggest that you review, reflect on these things, and act on some of those ideas. Contact me anytime. Thank you so much for enduring me for the last few minutes, and back over to you.
Thank you very much for your insightful presentation, Jim. We will quickly jump into the panel discussion, so feel free to private me with any questions that you have for our speakers, or you can use the raise your hand feature, and we will invite you to unmute yourself and speak so you can share that in the public chats. We have one question here. How can employees or managers know when bias or discrimination is a hindrance to the company's growth or advancement?
Could you repeat that question one more time?
Yes. How can employees or the managers know when bias or discrimination is a hindrance to the company's growth and advancement?
I'll start in on this, and Samin, you may have something to say as well. I think one of the important things that we all need to understand is that it's very dangerous to just expect other people to get enlightened without telling them that something is a challenge. Okay, and one of the things that we talk about in discussions and workshops is that everybody, this is part of that psychological safety. Everybody has to have the confidence, the comfort, and the interest in being able to voice a perspective that is different than others in the organization. As long as people do not speak out, it's not really reasonable to expect that somebody's going to just kind of through osmosis gather that insight. Okay, so that is really important. We need to engage with one another. When somebody's speaking out, the other person needs to listen with intent to understand, rather than endure that person talking while I'm putting up my response to them so I can shut them down. It has to be an inclusive conversation, and it's at that smallest level that the connections begin to grow in an organization. So it's about speaking out and having the confidence to do so. And if that confidence isn't there, that in itself is a significant problem. For the CEOs, who in your organization have you never heard from? Go talk to them, understand them, figure out what's going on in their heads.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, just to build on Jim's point, there are many symptoms based on my experience and my knowledge. There are many symptoms, but I would say some of the most common is that the culture is too nice. This is actually, it's like, oh, it's a very nice family culture. It's a very nice culture, but that nice culture has really been the barrier to talk about sort of the things we should be talking about, but we just want to be still very nice. So we don't really speak on that. And that's sort of, I have seen it more in North American, maybe culture and clients we are having. The next one, I think, again, these are just, it can be a list of symptoms. Another symptoms is like any change you want to make, you see there are some barriers. It's just, there's always something, it seems like there is something holding the change back. So that could be another signal for you that maybe that inclusivity, because you do need that inclusion environment to have everyone's buy-in to make a change happen. So that could be sort of a signal for you that, oh, maybe that's something I should check in my organization. Yeah, so I guess like these are, I would say, the two sort of misconception we might have about, yeah, inclusion.
All right, thank you so much for sharing, Samin. We have a question here. What are some tips for achieving inclusion in the virtual sphere?
I think I'm just going to echo what Jim said, and I 100% agree with that, that this online world, honestly, when it comes to psychology of people and organizational psychology and culture, I think whatever you could do in person, you can do it in online. Maybe online world, it just made it more visible. Maybe all the painkillers you were using in your organization, those painkillers are not working anymore because the online world made it sort of inevitable. But in terms of when it comes to really best sort of practices, it's really the same thing that you can apply when you were not online. But I would like to hear Jim's thought, and also anyone else's thoughts in the room. Yeah, we will. Yeah.
And there's a couple of things that I've learned to do in workshops that I actually used to do them in face-to-face workshops as well that I think are really valuable. When we do introductions, it's not just, you know, who you are and where you work and what you do. I'll ask a question like, tell the group something that nobody in the room knows about you, even for an intact organization. And you'll get some people telling amazing stories that they were once an Olympic athlete, or they were in this television commercial, or something like that. Or last weekend was a workshop, and I asked, you know, what is keeping you sane during the pandemic? And it turns out that you make connections just when you get these little introductions, these little high moments sort of thing. Last week in the workshop, almost half the class have dogs, and dogs seems to be a big thing that's helping people through the pandemic. I think it's a distraction from everything that's going on out there, and you've got to be outside a couple of times a day, that sort of thing. I think that connecting at a personal level is really important, and it can be done in the context of another meeting or a training session where there's an agenda to be held. But you can also have these connections over Zoom just to connect. And that is something that you want to build in to replace the water cooler conversations or the lunches that you used to have with people as well. So there's a couple of ideas there.
Thank you. So we have a question here from from Trevor for Jalapeno and Jim. In your practice, what have been the first practical steps you've taken internally to promote diversity and inclusion? I often find it's hard to translate these best practices into real tangible steps in my organization. So I guess the question is, what have been the first practical steps you've taken to promote diversity and inclusion internally?
I'll take it to start. Samin, I see you're turning your mic on and off. Yeah, I think the first step is again that reflection. What's the status quo in the organization? Samin talked about a really important point, how we tend to be really nice and polite in North America. And I would guess that in almost any organization that hasn't really paid attention to inclusion, there have been toes that have been stepped on, but nothing has been said. You need to pull out those conversations. You need to sit down and have frank discussions with everybody in the organization. What does it mean to you to work in this place? Are there any elements that you hold dearly to yourself that are diminished in this workplace, that we are holding you back in some way? And from that, you're going to learn, I think almost any organization will learn, this is a real thing and it's already here with us. And we have an opportunity to start addressing this now and take the baby steps to start learning how to engage with one another, how to connect appropriately, how to learn that somebody who I dismissed because of one reason or another actually brings tons of value to this organization. And I was wrong to think of that person that way. Samin?
Sure, I was just reading the questions. I to add to that. I'm going to just give you one simple example because diversity can be a little bit complicated, but just to give you a principle that anytime you want to make any change, what's that principle? You know, like I personally didn't understand the pain of sort of business owners, like why would they spend weekends to that? Like it's 9 to 5 job. Like it's just, I really couldn't understand the pain until I experienced it myself. So I think really with everything, like, because I always tell everyone, because of the position you're having in the company, whether it's entry, junior, business owner, or leadership, you really, what you're experiencing is only you experiencing it. And the first, very first step is, if there are two people, they really want to make a change, is to truly understand each other's position, to really understand how they're experiencing it. So when it comes to really make those changes, which goes back to Jim's point, that empathy, not in terms of, oh, I feel sorry for your pain, not really, that's not empathy, but just to really understand why they're behaving this way, why this is their your priority is not their priority. I think really the first step is not putting an action plan or anything together. It's just really be able to understand why they're behaving in this way, and it's just because of the position they're in. And yeah, and sometimes I feel like we put a lot of blame on sort of leaders or business owners, or even like white males, that, oh, it's just because of you if you're going through this. But we really have to understand their position, that the stuff that you're talking about right now, they never needed to think about it. They never really had sort of the experience with it. So I think the safe space that we are talking about, to talk about, is not only for minorities to really understand the position of majority. I myself, I never thought about my own identity until I moved to Canada. So I was like, that's why I don't blame them. Like, they never needed to think about their identity. So I think the safe space should be for both parties, not just minorities, but really have some empathy for majorities too, to be able to really have those conversations.
Thank you, Simin, for that. And Jim, we will take one question because we're running out of time. This question is by Noel, and she's asking, what would you say is the most challenging part of implementing a D&I program or initiative?
From my perspective, I think there's two challenges. One is to appreciate, like I said earlier, that this is not a cost that you need to endure so that people can get back to work and you can tick off that box. This is something that is very strategic. It's central to the culture of the organization. So that one challenge is that people need to understand that there is a valid business case for taking this on. The second challenge is to appreciate that this isn't a project that has a completion date. This is an ongoing process. It doesn't stop in the organization. You always have to pay attention to this in the organization. So I think going into this, being prepared to recognize that it is going to take a slice of our time all the way through, but that slice of our time is going to be small compared to the time that we've wasted because we haven't been intentionally inclusive in an organization.
Simin, would you like to add anything?
Sure, just maybe quickly, because of time. I think the challenge that we have been experiencing is that everyone's like, can you do a diversity and inclusion training for us? And we become that inclusive culture. But as Jim said, is a business case. To build that culture, then you need to evaluate your meetings. So the training should be how to do the meetings. So the meetings should follow diversity and inclusion trainings, norms. Then we should check out the daily meetings, or I don't know, like brainstorming sessions, strategic planning sessions. So it's not one-time training lecture, is that every single interaction you're having in the company, that needs to be changed to embrace inclusive norms. And I think that's sort of the challenge that we're having, that they sort of seek towards a painkiller, let's have the training, but really it's not that training that makes that change. It's just that all those single interactions you're having in the meeting in any form and shape needs to be evaluated to make sure it's putting the foundation for inclusion. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Simin. Thank you, Jim, for the interesting discussion. And I'd also like to thank the audience for the insightful questions. Before we bid you adieu, we promised that there was a surprise for everyone who attended the events today. So we would like to engage you in a quick, short, fun trivia. And the lucky participants today will have a chance to win a gift card, an Amazon gift card through answering the following questions. I will share my screen and there we go. So please sign into kahoot.it, and this is the pin. So you can do this through your cell phone or your tablet if you have any. And the questions will be displayed on the screen, and everyone participating will be able to answer questions. And do not hesitate to let me know if you have questions before the game begins. All right, we'll wait for 2 more people to join in and we'll get started. All right, awesome. All right. For the first question we have here, what is Jalapeno's website address? Is it jalapeno.ca, jalapeno.com, jalapeno.app, or none of the above? Ayo, 6 people got it right. It is www.jalapeno.app. All right, and I see that Trevor is taking the lead, followed by Noel. All right, so our second question here is, Dream Broso is the author of which books? Software Teamwork, Practical Agility, Jounce, or all of the above? Awesome. 6 people selected all of the above, and Trevor Noel is still in the lead. I see Dia and Magda coming up. The third question is, what are the services provided by Jalapeno? Coaching, consulting, counseling, or all of the above? Awesome. All right. Oh, Dia is on fire. Trevor is still in the lead, followed by Noel. And for our final question today, what are some of the area of Claris activities? So we have project plan facilitation, organizational culture assessment, team growth strategizing, or all of the above. Awesome. All right, and our second runner-up is D. And our first runner-up is Noel, and our winner is Trevor. All right, you just won yourself $20, $25, and $30 Amazon gift cards. I will turn this off. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. If there are any questions that you were unable to share today and you'd like answers to, please feel free to reach out to us at info@jalapeno.com, or you can reach out to Jim using the address on the screen. Be aware that you get the chance to win a $20 discount on our D&I training by filling out the feedback form that we will be emailing to you by tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining us today, and everyone who shared their perspectives, and Jim for the phenomenal session. Yeah, the conversation, we are both moving and thought-provoking. Again, do not forget to keep an eye out for your gift card and the feedback. So yeah, we look forward to seeing you in our next event. Stay back if you have any questions, and we'll be happy to answer them. If not, see you at our next event. All right.
Wow, that was really well done, ladies and gentlemen.
Question, was I too harsh and direct with my responses? Like,
No,
honest
it didn't seem like, no?
yeah,
No,
I just
it's honest.
stop blaming white male. They listen
Oh,
to
that took me by surprise, but I loved it. And I also loved when you said, oh, something really resonated with me. When you said you weren't aware of your identity until you moved to Canada. I was like, oh, that's so true. It's the same thing. with me.
Yeah.
I was not aware. And
them,
it's such a new, yeah, it's a nice perspective. It brings a difference. Yeah,
Okay.
I like that.
Well, and you know, from my perspective, there's still part of me